Welcome to Globo-Fest, Africa. Most scholars adhere to the belief that the earliest groups of people in world history migrated from Africa to other places over 200,000 years ago, which is called the out of Africa theory. Like most of the earliest world civilizations, the earliest African societies are thought to have emerged in East Africa thousands of years ago during the Neolithic era. One of these includes the Nile River civilization located in modern-day Egypt. The early Egyptians settled along the Nile River 5,000 years ago and used the steady flooding of the Nile and the silt from this flooding that provided irrigation for crops. Over time, the Egyptians channeled this flooding into canals and reservoirs, all leading to a steady food supply, food surplus, and job specialization within society. Job specialization allowed the Egyptians to focus on trade and other practices and helped them develop complex government systems and a written history using hieroglyphics. Egyptian history is divided into three main categories: the Old Kingdom period from 2700 to 2200 BCE, when all the pyramids were built; the Middle Kingdom period from 2050 BCE to 1650 BCE, which ended with a group of people called the Hyksos conquering Egypt, and then was followed by the New Kingdom period from 1550 BCE to 1070 BCE. Some of the most famous monuments were built by pharaohs during this time, such as Abu Simbel by Ramses II. Early Egyptians were polytheistic, with their chief gods as Amun-Re, the sun god, and Osiris, the god of the Nile. The Egyptians believed in life after death, carefully mummifying and preserving bodies for the afterlife, and then entombing them in carefully planned sarcophagi. The Egyptians had contact with other people along the Mediterranean, Nile, and from the Middle East, including the Nubians and the Mesopotamians. There is evidence to suggest that the Egyptians traded down and up the north-flowing Nile. Egyptians also maintained steady trade with Mesopotamians and Nubians during the New Kingdom period. This trade also led to conquest. The Egyptian-Nubian trade route connected Egypt to sub-Saharan Africa with the trading of ivory, animal hides, and ebony. The Egyptians eventually conquered the Nubians during the New Kingdom period, which is when Egypt became an empire. The Egypt-Mesopotamian trade was also important during the New Kingdom period, and Egypt will also add Mesopotamian lands to its growing empire, with having contact with the Hittites in Asia Minor, as well as with the Assyrians in Mesopotamia. Egyptian civilization was characterized by a complex social system with a pharaoh at the top, followed by priests, nobles, craftspeople, and merchants, farmers, and at the bottom, slaves. Egyptian women had higher status than other early civilizations and could own property, conduct business, as well as obtain divorces. The Egyptians made lasting contributions to science and art, including wide knowledge of the human body and medical knowledge like accurate diagnosis, as well as surgical techniques. The Egyptians developed a complex calendar, very similar to our own, and created statues, temples, and monuments that still survive today. Specific pieces of literature include the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which advised people on how to live in the afterlife. The Bantu migrations continued during this era through sub-Saharan Africa beginning before 600 BCE. The Bantu-speaking people are thought to have migrated south from West Africa to Eastern and Southern Africa. Many of the over 2,000 languages spoken in Africa are Bantu-based and show much similarity. The Bantu migration is thought to have begun from 1500 BCE and continued until 1000 CE. Early African kingdoms emerged during this time period, including the powerful West African kingdom of Ghana. Early African societies practiced animism and ancestor veneration. They developed trade across the Saharan desert from West Africa with gold and salt. And East African cultures like Nubia, the kingdom of Meroe, as well as Axum, participated in the Indian Ocean trade network with people from the Arabian Peninsula and eventually from India. This trade will eventually result in a diffusion of cultures and belief systems, as well as the institution of the African-run slave trade. Powerful cities involved in trade by 600 CE included Carthage, Alexandria, as well as many East African port cities. While many of the world's classical civilizations were falling into decline during this period, African kingdoms were prospering and gaining power. One of the earliest West African kingdoms was Ghana, which emerged and increased in size and power between 300 and 800 CE. The capital of this kingdom was Kumbi Saleh, and increased its power through the gold and salt trade across the trans-Saharan trade route. Ghana developed a well-organized and powerful army and eventually adopted Islam from North Africans who were called the Berbers in the 800s. In addition to Islam, the Kingdom of Ghana will adopt Arabic as a standard form of writing, as well as many other Muslim influences. The Kingdom of Mali will conquer Ghana and continue control over the gold and salt trade of the trans-Saharan trade network. One of the earliest conquering Malian chieftains or kings was Sundiata. The most famous Malian king was Mansa Musa, who, like many of the earlier kings of Ghana and Mali, had adopted Islam. Mansa Musa was a devout Muslim who made a pilgrimage to Mecca and built the capital city of Timbuktu as a powerful center for Islamic learning and scholarship. Following the decline of Mali, the Kingdom of Songhai emerged in the largest West African state between 1450 and 1600 CE. Just like prior kingdoms, Islam became the dominant religion and cultural influence. Other African trading kingdoms that will emerge during this era include the Hausa people in modern-day Nigeria, as well as the Forest Kingdom of Benin, and the East African trading states located in port cities like Mogadishu, Kilwa, and Sofala. These trading states will engage in maritime trade with the Persians, Arabian peoples, and Indians, and included the Arab slave trade. These people will combine Arabic with local Bantu-based languages to form a new language, one of which is Swahili. Much of what we know about pre-Arabic adoption in African societies is based on oral tradition, passed down from generation to generation by storytellers called griots. In many early African kingdoms, polygamy was practiced and still remains in practice today in some parts of the continent. Additionally, Africans will adopt many belief systems in addition to animism or shamanism and Islam, including Christianity and also Judaism to a lesser extent. Societies in Africa began to have expanded contact with Europeans between 1450 and 1750 CE as part of the era of old imperialism and European exploration and colonization. Most Europeans were primarily interested in the colonization of the Americas as well as Southeast Asia during this period. Africa became part of Europeans' triangular trade pattern in the Atlantic as part of the broader Columbian exchange of goods and products between Europe and the Americas, resulting in the introduction of crops from West Africa, like sweet potatoes, to the Americas and Europe, as well as the introduction of crops like corn to Europe and Africa from the Americas. During the era of old imperialism, Europeans' primary interest in Africa was the slave trade. Portuguese traders set up forts along the coasts of Africa during the 1400s, following Vasco da Gama's sailing around the continent to reach India and establish a spice trade network. But Europeans were unable to penetrate into the interior of Africa due to the geographic challenges like escarpments and cataracts, as well as the lack of technology needed to overcome these challenges. Consequently, under the Portuguese's lead, and because of the need for laborers in the Americas following the annihilation of Native Americans, the Atlantic slave trade was established to transport Africans to plantations across the Americas and the Caribbean. The Portuguese were often assisted by African kingdoms like the Ashanti kingdoms in the 1600s, who sold prisoners of war to the Europeans in exchange for European weaponry. This Atlantic slave trade, part of the triangular trade on the Atlantic and mercantilist policies of powerful kings from Europe, resulted in an estimated 11 million Africans being transported to the Americas via Middle Passage slave ships. This forced migration is called the African diaspora of people around the globe. European economic systems during the 14 through 1700s that affected Africa included mercantilism and eventually early capitalism. The slave trade continued until the 1800s. Other European contacts in Africa between the 14 and 1700s include the Dutch Boers, who settled in South Africa during the 1600s as part of a migration of Protestants from the Netherlands who were seeking religious tolerance. These Dutch people will eventually consider themselves to be Afrikaners, or white Africans. Following the European Industrial Revolution, beginning in the early 1800s, there will be an increase in technology and innovation, which will result in a push to colonize Africa. The Europeans finally had the technology needed to penetrate into the interior of Africa, steam engines, other machines, as well as modern weaponry to conquer those who resisted. European interest in Africa during the 1800s was heightened by the discovery of gold and diamonds in South Africa and resulted in a scramble for African territory and competition and rivalries between European nations. This scramble for overseas territories and subsequent colonization during what is often referred to as the European era of new imperialism resulted in all of Africa colonized by 1914, with the exception of Liberia and Ethiopia. Europeans were motivated to colonize this part of the world for several reasons. Europeans needed natural resources following the Industrial Revolution in Europe, as well as new markets for the items being made in new European factories. Additionally, Europeans were also looking for land for their growing populations and places to invest to make more money. Europeans justified the colonization of Africa by theories popularized during the 1800s, such as nationalism, social Darwinism, militarism, as well as a concept referred to as the white man's burden. One of the most well-known African imperialists and entrepreneurs was Cecil Rhodes, who helped establish the De Beers Diamond Company in South Africa, eventually becoming the leader of the Cape Colonies in South Africa and one of the most well-known social Darwinists of his generation. The initial scramble for African territory was led by Belgium's King Leopold II, who established the Congo as his personal backyard to harvest rubber and other resources, brutalizing and enslaving the native populations in the process. Other Europeans followed suit. In 1884, European leaders gathered in Berlin, Germany, at what became known as the Berlin Conference to divvy up the continent in order to prevent war from breaking out between European nations due to this scramble for territory. The continent was divided by European territorial claims, as well as natural geographic boundaries, which often arbitrarily divided tribes of people or resulted in boundaries and nations containing tribes that had historically been at odds with one another. These boundaries will eventually lead to ethnic conflict in many places following the colonial independence following World War II. Thanks for listening. Bye.